双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
Crotchet Castle by Thomas Love Peacock. Introduction. Thomas Love Peacock was born at Weymouth in 1785. His first poem, The Genius of the Thames, was in its second edition when he became one of the friends of Shelley. That was in 1812, when Shelley's age was 20, Peacock's 27. The acquaintance strengthened until Peacock became the friend in whose judgment Shelley put a special trust. There were many points of agreement. Peacock, at that time, shared, in a more practical way, Shelley's desire for root and branch reform. Both were poets, although not equally gifted, and both loved Plato and the Greek tragedians. In Crotchet Castle, Peacock has expressed his own delight in Greek literature through the talk of the Reverend Dr. Folliot. But Shelley's friendship for Peacock included a trust in him that was maintained by points of unlikeness. Peacock was shrewd and witty. He delighted in extravagance of a satire which usually said more than it meant, but always rested upon a foundation of good sense. Then also there was a touch of the poet to give grace to the utterances of a clear-headed man of the world. It was Peacock who gave its name to Shelley's poem of Alastor, or The Spirit of Solitude, published in 1816. The spirit of solitude being treated as a spirit of evil, Peacock suggested calling it Alastor, since the Greek text means an evil genius. Peacock's novels are unlike those of other men. They are the genuine expressions of an original and independent mind. His reading and his thinking ran together. There is free quotation, free play of wit and satire, grace of invention too, but always unconventional. The story is always pleasant, although always secondary to the play of thought for which it gives occasion. He quarreled with verse, whimsically, but in all seriousness, in an article on the 4 Ages of Poetry, contributed in 1820 to a short-lived journal, Alia's Literary Miscellany. The 4 ages were, he said, the Iron Age, the Bardic, the Golden, the Homeric, the Silver, the Virgilian, and the Brass, in which he himself lived. A poet in our time, he said, is a semi-barbarian in a civilized community. The highest inspirations of poetry are resolvable into 3 ingredients: the rant of unregulated passion, the whining of exaggerated feeling, and the cant of factitious sentiment, and can, therefore, serve only to ripen a splendid lunatic like Alexander, a puling driveler like Werther, or a morbid dreamer like Wordsworth. In another part of this essay, he says, while the historian and the philosopher are advancing in and accelerating the progress of knowledge, the poet is wallowing in the rubbish of departed ignorance, and raking up the ashes of dead savages to find gewgaws and rattles for the grown babies of the age. Mr. Scott digs up the poacher and cattle stealers of the ancient border. Lord Byron cruises for thieves and pirates on the shores of the Morea and among the Greek islands. Mr. Southey wades through ponderous volumes of travels and old chronicles, from which he carefully selects all that is false, useless, and absurd, as being essentially poetical, and when he has a commonplace book full of monstrosities, strings them into an epic, and so forth. Peacock going on to characterize, in further illustration of his argument, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Moore, and Campbell. He did not refer to Shelley, and Shelley read his friend's whimsical attack on poetry with all good humor, proceeding to reply to it with a defense of poetry, which would have appeared in the same journal, if the journal had survived. In this novel of Crotchet Castle, there is the same good-humored exaggeration in the treatment of our learned friend, Lord Brougham, to whom, and to whose labors for the diffusion of useful knowledge there are repeated allusions. In one case, Peacock associates the labors of our learned friend for the general instruction of the masses with encouragement of robbery, page 172, and in another with body-snatching, or, worse, murder for dissection, page 99. The Lord deliver me from the learned friend, says Dr. Folliot. Brougham's elevation to a peerage in November 1830 as Lord Brougham and Vaux is referred to on page 177, where he is called Sir Guy du Vaux. It is not to be forgotten, in the reading, that this story was written in 1831, the year before the passing of the Reform Bill. It ends with a scene suggested by the agricultural riots of that time. In the 9th chapter, again, there is a passage dealing with Sir Walter Scott after the fashion of the criticisms in the 4 ages of poetry. But this critical satire gave nobody pain. Always there was a groundwork of good sense, and the broad sweep of the satire was utterly unlike the nibbling censure of the men whose wit is tainted with ill humor. We may see also that the poet's nature cannot be expelled. In this volume we should find the touch of a poet's hand in the tale itself when dealing with the adventures of Mr. Chainmail, while he stays at the Welsh Mountain Inn. If the story did not again and again break out into actual song, for it includes half a dozen little poems. When Peacock wrote his attack on poetry, he had, only 2 years before, produced a poem of his own, Rhododaphne, with a Greek fancy of the true and the false love daintily worked out. It was his chief work in verse, and gave much pleasure to a few, among them his friend Shelley. But he felt that, as the world went, he was not strong enough to help it by his singing. So he confined his writing to the novels, in which he could speak his mind in his own way, while doing his duty by his country in the East India House, where he obtained a post in 1818. From 1836 to 1856, when he retired on a pension, he was examiner of India correspondence. Peacock died in 1866, aged 81.
Ash M.
Note that in this tale Mac Cady is Mac Q, ed. son of a demonstration. Mr. Skyanar, the transcendentalist, is named from Ski as owner, the dream of a shadow, and Mr. Philpot, who loves rivers, is Phil O. Pot Amos. Crotchet Castle, by Thomas Love Peacock. Chapter 1. The Villa. Captain Jammy. I wad full fain hear some question tween you twae. Henry V. In one of those beautiful valleys, through which the Thames, not yet polluted by the tide, the scouring of cities, or even the minor defilement of the sandy streams of Surrey, rolls a clear flood through flowery meadows, under the shade of old beech woods, and the smooth mossy greensward of the chalk hills, which pour into it their tributary rivulets, as pure and pellucid as the fountain of Bandusium, or the wells of Scamander, by which the wives and daughters of the Trojans washed their splendid garments in the days of peace, before the coming of the Greeks. In one of those beautiful valleys, on a bold round-surface lawn, spotted with juniper, that opened itself in the bosom of an old wood, which rose with a steep, but not precipitous ascent, from the river to the summit of the hill, stood the castellated villa of a retired citizen. Ebenezer Mac Crotchet, Esquire, was the London-born offspring of a worthy native of the North Country, who had walked up to London on a commercial adventure, with all his surplus capital, not very neatly tied up in a not very clean handkerchief, suspended over his shoulder from the end of a hooked stick, extracted from the first hedge on his pilgrimage, and who, after having worked himself a step or two up the ladder of life, had won the virgin heart of the only daughter of a highly respectable merchant of Duke's Place, with whom he inherited the honest fruits of a long series of ingenuous dealings. Mr. Mac Crotchet had derived from his mother the instinct, and from his father the rational principle, of enriching himself at the expense of the rest of mankind, by all the recognized modes of accumulation on the windy side of the law. After passing many years in the alley, watching the turn of the market, and playing many games almost as desperate as that of the soldier of Lucullus, the fear of losing what he had so righteously gained predominated over the sacred thirst of paper money. His caution got the better of his instinct, or rather transferred it from the department of acquisition to that of conservation. His friend, Mr. Ramsbottom, the zodiacal mythologist, told him that he had done well to withdraw from the region of Uranus or Brahma, the maker, to that of Saturn or Vishnu, the preserver, before he fell under the eye of Jupiter or Seva, the destroyer, who might have struck him down at a blow. It is said that a Scotchman, returning home after some years' residence in England, being asked what he thought of the English, answered, "They hanna owa muckle sense, but they are an unco bra people to live amang," which would be a very good story, if it were not rendered apocryphal by the incredible circumstance of the Scotchman going back. Mr. Mac Crotchet's experience had given him a just title to make, in his own person, the last quoted observation, but he would have known better than to go back, even if himself, and not his father, had been the first comer of his line from the north. He had married an English Christian, and, having none of the Scotch accent, was ungracious enough to be ashamed of his blood. He was desirous to obliterate alike the Hebrew and Caledonian vestiges in his name, and signed himself E.M. Crotchet, which by degrees induced the majority of his neighbors to think that his name was Edward Matthew, the more effectually to sink the Mac. He christened his villa Crotchet Castle, and determined to hand down to posterity the honors of Crotchet of Crotchet. He found it essential to his dignity to furnish himself with a coat of arms, which, after the proper ceremonies, payment being the principal, he obtained, videlicet, crest, a crotchet rampant, in a sharp, arms, 3 empty bladders, turgescent, to show how opinions are formed, 3 bags of gold, bandin, to show why they are maintained, 3 naked swords, tranchant, to show how they are administered, and 3 barber's blocks, gaspant, to show how they are swallowed. Mr. Crotchet was left a widower, with 2 children, and, after the death of his wife, so strong was his sense of the blessed comfort she had been to him, that he determined never to give any other woman an opportunity of obliterating the happy recollection. He was not without a plausible pretense for styling his villa a castle, for, in its immediate vicinity, and within his own enclosed domain, were the manifest traces, on the brow of the hill, of a Roman station, or castellum, which was still called the castle by the country people, the primitive mounds and trenches, merely overgrown with greensward, with a few patches of juniper and box on the vallum, and a solitary ancient beach surmounting the place of the praetorium, presented nearly the same depths, heights, slopes, and forms, which the Roman soldiers had originally given them. From this cartel, Mr. Crotchet christened his villa. With his rustic neighbors he was, of course, immediately and necessarily a squire, Squire Crotchet of the castle, and he seemed to himself to settle down as naturally into an English country gentleman, as if his parentage had been as innocent of both Scotland and Jerusalem, as his education was of Rome and Athens. But as, though you expel nature with a pitchfork, she will yet always come back, he could not become, like a true-born English squire, part and parcel of the barley-giving earth. He could not find in game-bagging, poacher shooting, trespasser pounding, footpath stopping, common enclosing, rack renting, and all the other liberal pursuits and pastimes which make a country gentleman an ornament to the world and a blessing to the poor. He could not find in these valuable and amiable occupations, and in a corresponding range of ideas, nearly commensurate with that of the great King Nebuchadnezzar when he was turned out to grass. He could not find in this great variety of useful action, and vast field of comprehensive thought, modes of filling up his time that accorded with his Caledonian instinct, the inborn love of disputation, which the excitements and engagements of a life of business had smothered, burst forth through the calmer surface of a rural life. He grew as fain as Captain Jammy to hear some argument betwixt ony twae, and being very hospitable in his establishment, and liberal in his invitations, a numerous detachment from the advanced guard of the March of Intellect often marched down to Crotchet Castle, when the fashionable season filled London with exhibitors of all descriptions, lectures and else. Mr. Crotchet was in his glory, for, in addition to the perennial literati of the metropolis, He had the advantage of the visits of a number of hardy annuals, chiefly from the north, who, as the interval of their metropolitan flowering allowed, occasionally accompanied their London brethren in excursions to Crotchet Castle. Amongst other things, he took very naturally to political economy. Read all the books on the subject which were put forth by his own countrymen, attended all lectures thereon, and boxed the technology of the sublime science as expertly as an able seaman boxes the compass. With this agreeable mania, he had the satisfaction of biting his son, the hope of his name and race, who had borne off from Oxford the highest academical honors, and who, treading in his father's footsteps to honor and fortune, had, by means of a portion of the old gentleman's surplus capital, made himself a junior partner in the eminent loan-jobbing firm of Catchflat and Company. Here, in the days of paper prosperity, he applied his science-illumined genius to the blowing of bubbles, the bursting of which sent many a poor devil to the jail, the workhouse, or the bottom of the river, but left young Crotchet rolling in riches. These riches he had been on the point of doubling by a marriage with the daughter of Mr. Tachango, the great banker, when, one foggy morning, Mr. Tachango and the contents of his till were suddenly reported absent, and as the fortune which the young gentleman had intended to marry was not forthcoming, this tender affair of the heart was nipped in the bud. Miss Tachango did not meet the shock of separation quite so complacently as the young gentleman, for he lost only the lady, whereas she lost a fortune as well as a lover. Some jewels, which had glittered on her beautiful person as brilliantly as the bubble of her father's wealth had done in the eyes of his gudgeons, furnished her with a small portion of paper currency, and this, added to the contents of a fairy purse of gold, which she found in her shoe on the eventful morning when Mr. Tachango melted into thin air, enabled her to retreat into North Wales, where she took up her lodging in a farmhouse in Merionethshire, and boarded very comfortably for a trifling payment, and the additional consideration of teaching English, French, and music to the little Aploy Marwes. In the course of this occupation she acquired sufficient knowledge of Welsh to converse with the country people. She climbed the mountains, and descended the dingles, with a foot which daily habit made by degrees almost as steady as a native's. She became the nymph of the scene, and if she sometimes pined in thought for her faithless Strephon, her melancholy was anything but green and yellow. It was as genuine white and red as occupation, mountain air, time-fed mutton, thick cream, and fat bacon could make it, to say nothing of an occasional glass of XX, which Aploy Marwy, who yielded to no man west of the Wrekin in brewage, never failed to press upon her at dinner and supper. He was also earnest, and sometimes successful, in the recommendation of his mead, and most pertinacious on winter nights in enforcing a trial of the virtues of his elder wine. The young lady's personal appearance, consequently, formed a very advantageous contrast to that of her quondam lover, whose physiognomy, the intense anxieties of his bubble-blowing days, notwithstanding their triumphant result, had left blighted, sallowed, and crow's-footed, to a degree not far below that of the fallen spirit who, in the expressive language of German romance, is described as scathed by the ineradicable traces of the thunderbolts of heaven, so that, contemplating their relative geological positions, the poor deserted damsel was flourishing on slate, while her rich and false young knight was pining on chalk. Squire Crotchet had also one daughter, whom he had christened Lemma, and who, as likely to be endowed with a very ample fortune, was, of course, an object very tempting to many young soldiers of fortune, who were marching with the march of mind, in a good condition for taking castles, as far as not having a groat is a qualification for such exploits. She was also a glittering bait to divers young squires expectant, whose fathers were too well acquainted with the occult signification of mortgage, and even to one or two sprigs of nobility, who thought that the lining of a civic purse would superinduce a very passable factitious nap upon a threadbare title. The young lady had received an expensive and complicated education, complete in all the elements of superficial display. She was thus eminently qualified to be the companion of any masculine luminary who had kept due pace with the astounding progress of intelligence. It must be confessed that a man who has not kept due pace with it is not very easily found, this March being one of that astounding character in which it seems impossible that the rear can be behind the van. The young lady was also tolerably good-looking, north of Tweed, or in Palestine. She would probably have been a beauty, but for the valleys of the Thames she was perhaps a little too much to the taste of Solomon, and had a nose which rather too prominently suggested the idea of the Tower of Lebanon, which looked towards Damascus. In a village in the vicinity of the castle was the vicarage of the Reverend Dr. Folliot, a gentleman endowed with a tolerable stock of learning, an interminable swallow, and an indefatigable pair of lungs. His preeminence in the latter faculty gave occasion to some etymologists to ring changes on his name, and to decide that it was derived from Fallus Optimus, softened through an Italian medium into Fall Ottimo, contracted poetically into Folliato, and elided on lice into Folliot, signifying a first-rate pair of bellows. He claimed to be descended lineally from the illustrious Gilbert Folliot, the eminent theologian, who was a bishop of London in the 12th century, whose studies were interrupted in the dead of night by the devil, when a couple of epigrams passed between them, and the devil, of course, proved the smaller wit of the two. This reverend gentleman, being both learned and jolly, became by degrees an indispensable ornament to the new squire's table. Mr. Crotchet himself was eminently jolly, though by no means eminently learned. In the latter respect he took after the great majority of the sons of his father's land, had a smattering of many things, and a knowledge of none, but possessed the true northern art of making the most of his intellectual harlequin's jacket, by keeping the best patches always bright and prominent. Chapter 2. The March of Mind. Quoth Ralpho, "Nothing but the abuse of human learning you produce, Butler." "God bless my soul, sir," exclaimed the Reverend Dr. Folliot, bursting, one fine May morning, into the breakfast-room at Crotchet Castle. "I am out of all patience with this march of mind. Here has my house been nearly burned down by my cook taking it into her head to study hydrostatics in a sixpenny tract, published by the Steam Intellect Society, and written by a learned friend who is for doing all the world's business as well as his own, and is equally well qualified to handle every branch of human knowledge. I have a great abomination of this learned friend. As author, lawyer, and politician, he is triformous, like Hecate, and in every one of his three forms he is bifrons, like Janus, the true Mr. facing both ways of Vanity Fair. My cook must read his rubbish in bed, and, as might naturally be expected, she dropped suddenly fast asleep, overturned the candle, and set the curtains in a blaze. Luckily, the footman went into the room at the moment, in time to tear down the curtains and throw them into the chimney, and a pitcher of water on her nightcap extinguished her wick. She is a greasy subject, and would have burned like a short mold. The reverend gentleman exhaled his grievance, without looking to the right or to the left. At length, turning on his pivot, he perceived that the room was full of company, consisting of young Crotchet, and some visitors whom he had brought from London. The Reverend Dr. Folliot was introduced to Mr. Mac Cady,